This video covers modules 14 and 15 in your book. We will be discussing biodiversity and adaptations. To start, it is quite difficult to estimate the number of species that are on Earth because we can't explore everywhere, particularly deep in the ocean. We know there are lots of microorganisms in insects, even more that we don't even know about yet. But scientists have estimated that there are between 5 and 100 million species on the Earth, which is quite the range, but that's where we are. We measure biodiversity in terms of species richness and species evenness. So, richness tells us the number of species in an area, and evenness describes the relative proportion of individuals. And these are able to be calculated by the Shannon Diversity Index and Simpson's Diversity Index. Why do we care? We need to be able to determine if a region is being disrupted by human activities and how ecosystems respond after a disturbance, whether that is by humans or by nature. This picture shows two communities, each with the same number of species, but community one is more diverse because it is more even. So its relative proportion of species is closer to the same than in community two, where it's mostly just species A. Evolutionary relationships among species can be illustrated using phylogeny, which you can see these branching tree diagrams here. It is our branching pattern of evolutionary relationships, and it shows how closely related organisms are. And to determine these, it's a combination of morphology, behavior, and genetics. Now it is, more so genetics than anything else because we know that the more genetics they have in common, the more closely related they are. Genetic diversity is created through mutation and recombination. Earth's biodiversity is a product of evolution, which simply means change in a population over time. Microevolution occurs below the species level, and macroevolution gives rise to new species, genera, families, classes, or phyla. Recall from biology that a gene is a location on a chromosome. A genotype is the set of genes in an individual, and the phenotype is the traits expressed, or what you see. Lots of genotypes are determined by the environment. For example, the temperature of turtle eggs during incubation determines whether the turtle will be female or male. Another example is that the body shape of a water flea depends on whether or not a young smells a predator. So if it can sense that there are predators nearby, it will develop into one, and if it doesn't, then it develops into the other. Genetic diversity is created through mutation and recombination still. A mutation is a random change in the genetic code that maybe occurs during DNA replication. Mutation that occur in gametes can be passed on to future generations. A lot of mutations are lethal, which cause the embryo to die before it finishes developing, because that embryo would not be suitable for living. Some mutations are less severe and lead to birth, but might not lead to a typical lifespan. Few mutations improve the organism's chance for survival and reproduction, and those are the ones that end up, being the norm at some point later on within a population. Recombination occurs when a chromosome breaks off and attaches to another during reproductive cell division, which gives new allele combination or new versions of a gene. An example of this is the human immune system. Evolution can occur through artificial selection. We generally talk about evolution by natural selection, but with artificial selection, humans determine which individuals breed, which we have done forever with like pigs, horses, cattle, crops, and pets because we want what we want. Also, did you know how many plants are from wild mustard? This is years and years of artificial selection gave us kale, the superest food of them all. Some unintended results or consequences from this are that we do have antibiotic-resistant bacteria and herbicide-resistant weeds because they're used, so often. Few are able to survive even with exposure to that antibiotic or the herbicide. And then when they survive and reproduce, their offspring are also resistant, which is a problem. Next, let's talk about natural selection. In evolution by natural selection, the environment determines which individuals survive and reproduce. We know that traits vary in a population. Some trait combinations make an individual more likely to survive and reproduce, which leads to those traits being more common in the next generation. Natural selection favors traits that improve an individual's fitness. Fitness is the ability to survive and reproduce. Adaptation is a trait that improves fitness. And a lot of our ideas about this come from Charles Darwin in the 1800s. He took a boat trip around the world. He saw lots of things, and he came up with several key ideas. Number one is that individuals produce an excess of offspring. 2, not all offspring can survive. 3, individuals vary in traits. 4, differences in traits can be passed down from parents to offspring. And 5, differences in traits are associated with differences in ability to survive and reproduce, which we can see here in this diagram. This is a crustacean, and in the first generation, they have, 3 larger crustaceans and a small one. And then the next generation, since it's more favorable to be small and reproduce, after several generations, they are all small. Evolution can also occur through random processes such as mutation, gene flow, genetic drift, the bottleneck effect, and the founder effect. Mutations, here would be a non-lethal mutation, can add genetic variation to a population. So let's say we have a volcano eruption in an area where mice tend to be sandy color. Well, now we have all this, black lava rock everywhere. And so those sand-colored mice are very easily spotted by predators. So one develops a mutation and is able to survive. And after lots and lots of time, you will see that more mice that can blend in with the black hot lava rock are able to survive and reproduce. And this has happened in several places, particularly in like the mid to southwest region of the United States. And the interesting thing about it is that in different mice populations, it is a different mutation that causes the dark color fur. But because it's advantageous in that area, they survive and reproduce. I just think it's seriously incredible that it's a different mutation, even though the outcome and the pressure is the same. Evolution can also occur through gene flow, where individuals move from one population to another, which alters the genetic composition of both populations, which we see here. We have a population of panthers in Florida, and then some Texas panthers came to Florida. So their genetic composition is removed from the Texas population and added to the Florida population. And then they, breed, and we end up with, non-kinktail panthers. Genetic drift is when there is a change in genetic composition of a population from random mating. So in a small population, if we have 40% black mice and 60% white, with random mating over time, we end up with all white mice. In a large population, it ends up not, making that big of a difference, but it does in smaller populations. The bottleneck effect is a decrease in a population size that leads to a decrease in genetic diversity in a population. So there is some sort of event that causes a dramatic decrease in the population. And so sometimes, traits end up, they're based off the survivors. And so some traits are lost. For example, here, the nose spots ends up, being not a thing anymore after the bottleneck event. Last is the founder effect. So this is what Darwin would have seen on his trip through the Galapagos Islands. There is a change in the genetic composition of a population from a small number of colonizing individuals. So on the mainland, we have red, blue, and gray birds. But if only red and gray birds can fly to that island, that island population will be of only that type. And eventually, they may even develop into their own species. So that is all about biodiversity and adaptations.